Heidi-ho, Internet neighborinos. Dr. Trevor Ahrendt. I would like to welcome you back to our channel on control mastery and how psychotherapy works. I hope you've been enjoying our videos so far. Today, I wanted to talk about a topic that I think everybody who's a clinician will relate to, may even be interesting to you if you've sort of stumbled here as somebody who's just therapy curious. And this is the issue of countertransference and how control mastery in particular understands and utilizes countertransference. The Cliff Notes version of it is just like everything else so far relating to control mastery, utilizing countertransference has no one simple answer. The answer is it depends on what's going on in the case as how you're going to use it. However, what I do want to make the case to you in this video for is that utilizing and acknowledging countertransference is not only just a useful or nice thing to do, but it might even be completely integral to how the case formulation process works. So if that's interesting to you or even controversial, please stick with me. I'd love to make the argument to you that this is really a useful and maybe even necessary skill set for formulating and understanding control mastery. So, by the way, you'll see me looking around. I've got my notes here. I'm trying to look at the camera so that it simulates like you and I are having a conversation in real life. So just bear with me as my eyes dart around. I'm not doing something suspicious here. So I want to really talk about why countertransference from a control mastery perspective, like why focus on it, and then I also want to spend a little bit of time on why countertransference is avoided or downplayed at times in therapy, and then most importantly, how do we effectively use countertransference to promote therapy that works for people. Just a little note about countertransference because the term can be confusing and there's a couple different definitions. So my understanding was that the original definition of countertransference in the early analytic days was that the patient would have transference onto the therapist, obviously, and then the therapist would have feelings in reaction to those transferences, and that would be the countertransference. And I think the original idea was that those would be separated from just some of the therapist's own personal reactions versus the reactions that they have that are very specific to the transference that the person brings into the room. For our purposes, while I think that distinction can be useful some of the times, for our purposes, I think that we're mostly going to think about countertransference primarily just as the therapist's emotional reactions to the patient and the treatment. And there will be a little bit of distinction there as we get into it, but I think it makes it a little too convoluted to imagine it's just in reaction to the transference. So for simplicity's sake, and because I think it's more parsimonious and effective, we're just going to really think about countertransference as how do I feel towards this patient? How do I feel in the presence of this patient? Okay? So first of all, let me make an argument about why we want to focus on countertransference in control mastery formulation. So first of all, one of the things that we're trying to do very quickly when we're working with a patient from a control mastery perspective is we're trying to establish a robust formulation, understanding what the patient's goals are, conscious and unconscious, and what type of environment that they need in therapy in order to feel safe to achieve those goals. So how do we understand the patient's plan, as we call it? Well, oftentimes the example or the guidance that's given is take a thorough history. That is an excellent tool. If there is a technique in control mastery, that's about as close as it gets, is to really get a good thorough history when you can from the patient, because it really does help orient you. However, there are some potential problems with that. Two big ones. One, sometimes gathering a history is anti-plan for the patient. So for example, say you have someone come in who has felt alone in the world, they don't feel like other people have much to offer them, and they're really in crisis. And they come in with a very practical problem, like my child is cutting and I don't know what to do and I'm really panicked about it. If you as the therapist were to say, okay, that's really important, let's take a full session or two to get a very thorough history from you to really understand what you're needing, what the formulation is, and then we'll get to that. That could be very anti-plan for the patient and actually make them feel more unsafe. So I think for certain patients, gathering a really thorough history is not what's called for at the beginning, and you have to be sensitive to the fact that some people are going to need the flexibility for you not to get a thorough history at the beginning. So that's the first point. The second point is that one of the core tenets of control mastery is that as safety is established, patients are able to access new feelings, they're able to think of and try new behaviors, and they're able to access memories with more clarity. It's not uncommon for someone to come in and say, well, what was your relationship with your parents like? They say, it was great, it was fine. And then a year into therapy, you've learned many things that were not great and fine. Some of it may be just straight up abusive, or some of it just might have ill-equipped them for the challenges that they're facing now, which is why they're in therapy. I have had experiences with patients where I have been 2 years into treatment, and we have discovered some dynamic that was totally unconscious in their relationship with a parent up until that point. And no matter how many times I asked directly about it, I would never get that information from that patient because it was like a fish trying to see water. So what I'm getting at is that patients at times, through no fault of their own, this is a very human thing, we all do this, are unreliable narrators. Again, to just belabor the metaphor, it's like a fish trying to see water. So sometimes you can't actually give an accurate history of what happened until you've learned what things were not normal or were painful or difficult for you so that you can go back and look at them with fresh eyes. So countertransference can be an extremely valuable tool that you can utilize very quickly to get some insight into the patient's world without them needing to communicate consciously and didactically what their experience was. And then just one final point about this is, as we've talked about with testing before, countertransference and an understanding of countertransference is absolutely baked into the bread of control mastery theory. I don't know why we're going with a sort of bread metaphor. Let's not go further with that. That'll get weird. But well, let's just keep going. No matter how you slice it, you're going to have to get in touch with your countertransference, because one of the main ways of understanding and utilizing control mastery is through understanding testing, right? And there are two broad types of tests: passive into active, where the patient treats you like they were treated. You need to know what your countertransference is there, because oftentimes you can understand it's a passive into active test when you feel things very intensely. You feel very ashamed, you feel very trapped, you feel very frightened, you feel very inadequate. That the patient is treating you like they were treated, and so you're experiencing the emotional experience that they had when they were overwhelmed by a traumatic event. Or more common, transference testing, it's literally called transference testing, where the patient invites you to treat them like they were treated. So they start to do a dance in the relationship, saying like, oh, I'm expecting you to criticize me, I'm expecting you to criticize me, so I'm going to do things that invite some annoyance and frustration on your end so that you want to criticize me. So in order to successfully navigate transference tests, you have to be aware of and knowledgeable about what your countertransference is. So I hope that makes the case that countertransference from a control mastery perspective is absolutely essential. Clinicians can sometimes have a hard time with countertransference, though. That they can get nervous because they worry that their countertransference or feeling towards the patients are untherapeutic, right? A lot of us have this idea of the type of therapist, the platonic ideal of the type of therapist that we're supposed to be, and that's sort of unfailingly patient, unfailingly compassionate, unfailingly warm, unfailingly understanding. It's a bunch of horse. You know what? That's just not plausible for human beings to have. And from my opinion, and hopefully by the end of this little video, you might be inclined to agree with me. Not only is that impossible, but I actually think that sort of stance is anti-therapeutic, because it's so unrealistic to what relationships between human beings are like. It's much more useful to be a human, have strong countertransference reactions that are contained and examined, and then utilize that effectively in the therapy. Therapists are also worried that countertransference is too subjective, so it's not useful, it's not objective enough data. I'm going to address that later. That's an important concern that should be really forefront of your mind when you're understanding your countertransference. But I think there are ways of guarding against it, and you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater just because of fears that it's too subjective. The other thing is sometimes countertransference can make us uncomfortable, especially for the aforementioned reason. It's like, oh, I'm a bad therapist if I feel annoyed at my patient or impatient with my patient. I'm not supposed to, so therapists want to avoid that, suppress it, deny it, etc. And oftentimes, unfortunately, countertransference is really only addressed when it's a major problem. So as opposed to thinking about it early and being curious and open to it as the relationship builds. People kind of put it off, and then all of a sudden they're like really aggravated or really stuck with somebody, and then they start to think about countertransference. So this is an argument to be aware of your countertransference from the first moment you have contact with somebody, really mapping it into the formulation. So let's look at some of the challenges using it just a little bit more, which is that the good therapist trap is really, really dangerous for a lot of therapists. And part of the reason is that in early training, I think a lot of times raw feelings are discouraged, especially enacting raw feelings towards a patient are discouraged to practice containment. I actually think that's an extremely valuable learning technique early on in therapy and absolutely necessary for most people. But people maybe overcorrect with it. And then there was also this terrible period during the 50s in analytic training where this idea of the blank slate therapist became elevated, which is just not helpful. The research on still face experiments, in my opinion, really just shows how a bizarre relationship that is for the vast majority of patients. Again, from a control mastery perspective, there might be some that's beneficial, but just having that as a rigid orthodoxy is terribly unhelpful for most people. And a lot of therapists actually that I've worked with in supervision and consultation, one of the biggest challenges to using their countertransference is that, believe it or not, maybe they weren't actually ever that good at knowing what they were feeling, which might seem strange to some people, but therapists are often recruited into being the helper in their family, discouraged from having their own feelings, really adept at understanding everybody else's and suppressing their own needs. So some therapists actually have a really hard time even accessing what they're feeling. I'll ask people, how do you feel towards this patient? And they'll often say, good or caring. And I'll say, yeah, okay, but how do you really feel towards them? Or can we get a little more specific? I mean, you have a whole relationship and they're kind of blank. So when we're talking about countertransference, one of the things that I want you to practice with is think about your patient, not as your patient, just as a thought experiment, but I want you to think about, how would my grandma talk about this person? Or how would my blunt friend talk about this person? So we want this very unfiltered sort of reaction to them. And another tool that I have found helpful is, instead of thinking of them as your patient, which creates a certain dynamic, and the reality is you're only meeting with them in a short amount of time, usually an hour a week, maybe an hour every other week, in a very contained, very specific type of dyad. So that really manages a certain type of feeling that's going to come up between you two. Instead of thinking of them in your patient as a patient, think about, how would I feel being friends with this person? How would I feel being partnered with this person? How would I feel starting a business with this person? These are the types of countertransference reactions that are going to be much more useful for formulating from a control mastery perspective than just thinking of them as your patient. And doing this, the benefit of this, in addition to the formulation, where it fits into formulation, which I'm just about to get to, the benefits of doing this is that working with your countertransfer in this way allows you to like your patients in a more fundamental way and even adore them or really enjoy them. Because one, it manages the difficult reactions that you're having more effectively. It helps fit them into the formulation, which gives them a meaning, so that allows you to tolerate them. It also might give you an ability to talk to the patient about them in a more effective way. And when you like your patients fundamentally, you're just more receptive to them and you're much more responsive, which improves outcomes. So from my opinion, it is a clinical emergency if you do not like your patient. I think that it's a pretty good goal to utilize formulation techniques and supervision, your own therapy, etc., to understand and utilize your countertransference, but get to a place of enjoying all your patients. It doesn't mean that you would necessarily want to start a business with all of them, right? Or be friends outside of therapy per se, but within the context of the therapeutic relationship, I think it's an absolute necessity to really work towards enjoying them. So let's talk about how to utilize countertransference from a control mastery perspective. It's relatively simple, but it's very important, and it's easier said than done, just like a lot of control mastery. The principles are relatively simple. Applying them in practice is not quite as easy. You need to do it's trickier than you might think, although the concepts are really pretty straightforward, I think. So first of all, you just want to be aware of your countertransference. That was my whole preamble about this, was trying to open the door of various ways, make an argument of why, and then look at the potential problems, and then how to access your countertransference. So first of all, you just need to be aware of your raw, unvarnished reactions to the client. And I think actually the early stages of therapy are particularly critical in this regard, because over time, as you get to know somebody, it does become much easier to like them because you empathize with them, you understand the story, et cetera, et cetera. Familiarity alone just breeds a certain type of closeness and comfort with each other. So it's really the early sessions, even right from the first phone call or email, you want to start really clocking, what does this feel like to interact with this person? Are they likable? Do I feel warmly towards them? Do I feel anxious? Am I concerned? Do I feel suspicious? Do I feel excited? Do I feel like I really want to help them? There's no wrong reaction here. You want to just really track all of that. So that's the first thing. So you want to capture, what is my countertransference with this person? Then you want to be doing the rest of the formulation work. So you want to be getting some of a history, trying to establish their goals, etc. And then what you want to really do with your countertransference is ask this absolutely critical question. And this is the one that really prevents against the dangers of subjectivity. Is you want to ask yourself, are my reactions to this patient mirrored in other relationships in this patient's life? So in other words, like, let's say you have a patient come in, they're very quiet, they don't make eye contact, and they answer questions very briefly, or they demur, and they never go very deeply into anything, and they don't volunteer a lot of information. And your countertransference winds up becoming boredom, frustration, and the urge to distance, or maybe sometimes the urge to like really get in there and be like, frickin' talk to me for God's sake. So you really want to ask that question. Do I think other people in the patient's life responds to them this way? Just the thought experiment of, do I imagine that other people might have the same reaction? And then objectively, can I learn from the patient that other people have reactions to them like this? If all of that stuff lines up, you can feel confident that the countertransference reactions should be slotted into the formulation. Now, if the answer to that is no, like, in other words, if you're like, well, I find this patient incredibly comfortable to be around because they don't volunteer a lot and I don't have to do anything, blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh, that's not really what the patient is reporting. You know, that other people tend to leave them or get annoyed at them. Then you really need to interrogate, okay, well, what's up with that reaction? Is that an idiosyncratic reaction based on my history and my relationship style? And if that's the case, there's nothing wrong with that. You just acknowledge that, learn that. Maybe there's some supervision or therapy that you can do around that to understand it better, or to get out of that sort of groove that you might get into them with them. That could be really kind of an enactment or kind of just lead you to a dead end in the treatment. But just recognize, oh, those particular reactions, they're not helpful to formulating. They don't have anything to do with this patient's goals. Me bringing that into the treatment is almost certainly not useful to them, and it's not going to serve them. That's something that I deal with elsewhere. The only other way that I can think it would be useful to treatment is just to acknowledge and own if it comes up in the therapy, like, look, I have my own idiosyncratic reactions to this that's based on my history. It has nothing to do with you, really. And don't worry, you know, you could say it's not something I think we can concern ourselves with. It's my stuff. Sometimes that's satisfying to patients. Sometimes you might need to explain a little bit more. Hopefully you can just actually kind of partition that elsewhere, deal with it, and really focus on the treatment in the way that the patient needs you to. Okay, so once you have the countertransference and awareness of it, once you are aware that it slots into the formulation, then you use it to build the formulation, or vice versa. So the transference, so you might hypothesize from there, maybe because this patient's very quiet, you can't get a lot of history from them, right? So you don't actually know what their history is very well, but you can assume that the transference test is to either abandon them or attack them, because that's the urges that you have, and that's the evidence that you have that is within the patient's life of how relationship patterns go. So even without a thorough history, you could assume that the transference test would be to back away and give them space, which might be a reasonable instinct of like, oh, they're nervous, I don't want to be too intrusive, I should just back off and give them time. But you might hypothesize that that would be a failed transference test because maybe they do need you to be proactive and warm, obviously without being attacking or critical, but really remain present for them and then use that as a way of helping them warm up. Now, the proof would be in the pudding, of course, because that would be a hypothesis. So then you would want to look, when I adopt this treatment attitude of being warm and persistent, does the patient get better? Are they able to talk more freely? Is new affect emerging? Is new history emerging? Does it feel like we're just getting along in the room and there's a warmth between us? And if that's the case, probably you will get more history to fill in, and you can even start to reference your countertransference potentially, like, oh yeah, when you were quiet, I kind of thought, oh, maybe I should back away and give you space. But now I'm like wondering if actually that's what winds up happening to you. And I wonder if there were, times that you were left alone a lot in your life and that you were longing for more connection, but it wasn't clear to you how to get it or whether you were entitled to it or something to that effect. So basically, it's relatively simple, but it's not easy all the time. So you want to be very aware of your countertransference, and then you want to build it into the formulation. And just like every other aspect of the formulation, your countertransference needs to fit into it very neatly, like a puzzle piece. So if your countertransference is very different from the transference test, that's something you need to figure out ASAP, in my opinion. And you probably either need to conclude, oh, that's idiosyncratic reactions on my part. Okay, great, don't worry about it. Or my formulation might be wrong because my countertransference is so squarely opposed to what I thought it was based on the formulation data. So maybe another clinical example just to illustrate it. So let's say you have a patient who comes in and they present in a way that is very big in the room. They have a loud voice, they monologue, you can't find a way in with them. And you wind up trying to help them, you try to be empathic, you try to mirror their experiences, and every time you do, they get more agitated and more anxious. So I could imagine a couple different countertransferences this, but let's say that you feel overwhelmed yourself, you feel ineffective, and then you feel like you just want to drift away. You just say, I don't know how to help this person. Like, they seem to do okay on their own. Let me just leave them alone. And so if that's the case, that you might start to think, okay, do other people in their life feel this way? And if you do get data and other people in their life feel overwhelmed by them, they don't know how to help, and that the person maybe just sort of like bulldozes them even when they're trying to help, that's when you might be able to start to say, okay, as much as I want to back away, as much as I find it frustrating to try to engage with this person, I'm going to double up on really trying to get in there. I'm going to really stop them, slow them down. I'm going to have a very strong presence in the room so that they can really feel that I'm there, because I'm concerned that the transference test is to get overwhelmed and leave them by themselves. And maybe that's a repetition of the trauma that they had. So that would be one way. Now, another hypothesis for this one could be that the person is really aggravating, you feel annoyed, and you want to really argue with them and attack them. And so if that's your countertransference, and this is where I think some of the mystery of psychotherapy comes in, or sort of the, I don't know, a magical element is too strong, but the exciting sort of mysterious aspect is that on paper, like you could imagine how each reaction makes sense, but in practice, there's a very distinct feeling tone that comes with different people. And so that if you have 10 people interview the same person, they all might want to back away and feel overwhelmed, whereas 10 people might say the same, person with a similar presentation on paper, loud, overbearing, monologuing, so might get really aggressive or annoyed about them. So if that's your countertransference, right, then you would want to hypothesize, it's probably, and look for evidence. Do other people get in arguments, get frustrated with them, kind of wind up, sort of attacking them and say, oh, shut up, like you just go on and on, blah. If that's the case, then you would want to take a little bit more of a calmer presence with them, maybe a step back and see if that works. So the countertransference is a window into formulation that still has to be validated with all the other aspects of the formulation and all the other safeguards of the control mastery formulation, making sure that the puzzle pieces fit. I think it's absolutely critical to have people in your life that I call froligs, which are friend colleagues, that you can talk very frankly about your countertransference with and have them understand that they're not going to think you're a bad therapist or a bad person. Because I think those raw reactions are gold. They're like gold veins that need to be mined. And I think sometimes consultation can be too stifled when therapists are like, oh, I have to be really professional. I want to be thought of as good. This is very understandable. And there are people who can judge countertransference. So it's not a crazy precaution to take. And there are also therapists who are very uncontained at times. And so when you hear somebody just spouting off about somebody, you go, ooh, boy, I hope they're thinking about that. So, but I think having relationships with other therapists that are frolics, where you can be very raw and then also very reflective together. And the frolics can also kind of call you on your stuff and say, well, but you kind of get like that with people. Or like, yeah, that sounds like the data fits. Is an absolutely essential tool to really utilize in countertransference effectively and ethically. Last point, I just want to, this is one of my hobby horses, is that a lot of control mastery's work or evidence or the approach is well validated by other theories, which is, in my opinion, a very powerful argument for something being true, capital T. If something's true, capital T, multiple lines of evidence from different areas will hopelessly wind up converging on it because they can't help but wind up pulled into the gravity of where the evidence leads. So utilizing countertransference in this way is highly congruent with time-limited dynamic psychotherapy, which is very well researched. It fits perfectly with the time-limited dynamic therapy cyclical maladaptive model. It also mirrors some of what Paul Wachtel talks about in cyclical psychodynamics. That's his conceptualization of it. A lot of the modern analytic literature, although sometimes it gets really moves into more of the analytic, I don't know what to call it exactly, but structures around the psyche, which control mastery is a little bit less interested in beyond the basics. But a lot of the relational field, intersubjectivity, etc., a lot of that really lines up with this idea about control mastery's idea of what to do with countertransference. So, okay, I hope that was helpful. Leave a comment below if you have questions or thoughts. And also, please leave us comments about future video topics that you want. We've got a big list, but we're always interested in like what would be really useful to people, what are folks interested in. So if there are areas of the psychotherapy world that you're looking for, that you want an idea of how would control mastery think about this, or how would control mastery integrate these ideas, please leave a comment because we would love to make videos about that sort of stuff. So sign up for our newsletter if you're interested, join the mailing list, and then we've got classes and case conferences going on, but just signing up for the mailing list and getting the free ebook, no obligation, go from there. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good one.